face and fill the stock by the fireplace. So you have a you that's true. She's been eating Baba, have a you that's true.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. Boy, howdy, we are getting closer to the day. It is Tuesday, December 19th, year of our Lord, 2017. I'm Suzanne Sherman, and you have tuned into the Cerberus Radio Network, where here we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Jeff Johnson joins me today. He's producing the show. Jeff, I got to thank you time and time again. I could not do this show without you, coming hot off the heels of Jeff Johnson's show, The Paradigm Shift. We try and do our shows together and give our listeners an opportunity to have 2 hours of back-to-back live radio. Can't always get it done on Monday, but here we are on Tuesday getting it done. I want to encourage you to follow us on Facebook, facebook.com, Cerberus Radio Network. We also have a fan page with some great discussions going on, facebook.com/CRN. You can also follow me at Cowgirl Esquire. That is facebook.com/Cowgirl Esquire. Feel free to send me messages during the show if you're so inclined. We also have a phone number, 717-467-1736. Beg your pardon, so 4671736. Jeff, I want to thank you again. I was out of the state. I was in California visiting family, and it is good to be back. We're a day late, and I want to start off with this story. I have a friend that has been contacting me for a while, seeking some legal advice for a family member, her uncle in Pennsylvania, and she's in Oregon and has not been able to get out there and help this man personally. And she told me that the story was going to be running in the local news and she would get me the link. And apparently his home has been taken over by a woman and her family who were sent there to assist him. He's an 81-year-old Army veteran. We're going to play. Would you be able to play the link from that news broadcast, Jeff?
Yes, I have it queued up. I'm ready to go whenever you're ready.
All right. One of the messages I always try to convey to my listeners, because we, as you know, combine prepping, politics, history, and there's a method to my madness. I know nobody out there is crazy enough to try and tie all this into one show and one philosophy for their show. But I try and let people know, look, you need to be prepared to handle situations. You need to put your family, worship God, worship family, and not government. And this story sums up exactly what happens when you fail to do that, when you substitute government for your family relations and expect somebody else to solve a problem. Let's just have you run with that, Jeff, and then I will expound upon the story, because I have a lot of background information that isn't given forth in there, and let people know. And I'm trying to let everybody know about this. I'm going to try and call the police station later myself. Again, I heard this last night. It's got a lot of people fired up. I've been sharing this on Facebook, and a friend of mine actually is friends with the DA in a neighboring town, and he's going to be on top of this and let me know what's happening. That being said, why don't you queue up and roll that story, please?
As the parent gets older, sometimes people rely on home health care aides to care for the elderly parent at home.
But one local woman is accusing an aide of draining her stepdad's bank accounts and taking over his home. Andy Sheehan investigates.
Yes, I'm coming out. Yes, I'm coming.
Don Cameron is an 81-year-old career U.S. Army veteran with a bad heart, a failing memory, and a myriad of health problems. In this apartment with his 2 chihuahuas, Jack and Bella. But until recently, Don lived in this house owned by him and his wife, who's now in a nursing home with Alzheimer's. He and his stepdaughter, Nadine, say the house has been taken over. His former home health aide, who moved in with their family and pets nearly a year ago, and have moved Don out.
We've stripped everything from this man.
Everything.
Everything. His life, he worked for this his whole life, it's gone. His home, his cards, his property. They've destroyed it, and now they won't leave.
I just flat got took. Of me left and right. I just think about it, I just shudder.
About a year ago, these two had a falling out and stopped speaking with one another. Stepdaughter Nadine had the VA send health aides, one of whom was named Melissa Miller, who was to attend to his needs during the day. But soon after, things took a turn. After getting to know Don, Melissa Miller told him her family needed a temporary place to stay. When Don agreed, Melissa moved in with her husband Charles and a half-dozen children and their dogs. Nadine says they immediately began draining his bank account.
Got the bank statements. They were taking $300, $400 out of the ATM. 6 days I counted out of the bank.
Last April, Don signed this power of identifying Miller as his daughter, giving her complete control over his finances. Though it's not clear, given Don's mental state, he knew the implications of what he was signing. But records from Don's credit union account show first-of-the-month cash withdrawals in the thousands, as well as hundreds of dollars in purchases from Sam's Club and local restaurant. There's even $500 in purchases at the Cleveland Air Show and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Even though Don had $5,000 a month coming in pensions and Social Security, the household fell into arrears. 2 of his cars were repoed, and utilities went unpaid.
Here's the garbage.
Right.
That's $300. Gas, close to $2,000.
The electric's almost $2,000. I called them yesterday.
And none of these bills have been paid.
Nothing's been paid.
After Don was released from the hospital with a heart attack, Don says he wanted to return, but the Millers told him the house was no longer safe for him and they could no longer care for him there. Nadine says they dropped him off at this apartment with no bed and little food. That's when the super of the apartment complex contacted Nadine, who was shocked to learn of what happened to her stepfather in her absence.
They've ripped him off. They've taken everything. He doesn't even have his bed. And when I got here and talked to Becky, the manager, he had no food, hardly. His dogs hadn't eaten in days. He was hungry.
I went over to Don's house in Shenango and found the Miller family still lives there with no signs of leaving. Is Melissa here? Can I talk to you? Can I talk to you? I'm Andy Sheehan with KDK. The teenage girl who answered the door didn't want to speak with me, and moments later the police arrived with a report that we were trespassing. Nadine also arrived telling the police chief what...
I'm learning this as you're telling me.
Later, I got a call from Charles Miller, who denied taking advantage of Don or draining his accounts, saying he and his wife had been caring for Don while his own family had abandoned him, and that after his wife was laid off as a health aide, Don asked them to stay. But back at his apartment, Don himself had nothing but bitterness for the actions of the Miller family.
What could I say but just send them to hell? I'm sorry.
No?
That's too good for him.
This family continues to live in Don Cameron's home, but investigations and court proceedings are underway, and we'll keep you abreast of any new developments. In Shenango Township, Andy Sheehan, KDK TV News.
Is that not infuriating, Jeff? If that were a member of my family, I think I would go over there and assist these people in leaving that home personally. But here's the problem. And Mr. Miller, the husband of Melissa Miller, the hired caregiver, said that the family had abandoned him. And for all intents and purposes, they pretty much had, as the story indicates and as the family member confirms, the stepdaughter Nadine and Don Cameron had a falling out, and they had not spoken in a year. That leaves the door open for this type of abuse, because what happened here is an elderly, vulnerable gentleman who needed assistance from his family, didn't get it. The family member instead decided to substitute the government to fulfill an obligation that they had. And this sums up perfectly what I say time and time again. If you rely on the government to solve a problem in times of calamity, be it personal or broader in scope, you are going to be disappointed. The greater the calamity or the trouble that you find yourself in, the greater your disappointment will be if you rely on the government. and not yourself. And this is an example of the failing of the families in this union today. There are people out there who are predatory and will seek opportunities to take advantage of individuals in this vulnerable position. I also tell people you need to be prepared and to plan, not just for times of unrest or disasters, but for times in a life that might be unpleasant, people don't like to talk about. Plan with estates. The background of this story that's not on the news is that this gentleman, and I think this might be why there was some delay in evicting these people from the property. The gentleman here, Don Cameron, is not on the deed. The background information I got from his niece is that the house had been in his wife's family. Now, this wife now is presently in a nursing home because she has advanced Alzheimer's disease. She was the name on the lease, and she signed over I believe, I'm not the lease, but the deed, the property to Nadine, who is the stepdaughter in this story. But they, as the news report correctly indicates, had a falling out. So they weren't speaking anymore. And this gentleman, because oftentimes police will say, well, who owns the property? And if you don't own the property, you're going to have a hard time kicking somebody out. So that's the only hook that I can think of why this wasn't acted upon sooner. Also, the indication that the police officer, when he was interviewed, I believe he was the police chief, said, this is the first I'm learning about this, is an out and out lie. They have been contacting him and calling him and trying to get assistance from the police department out there for some time, and to no avail. Apparently, protective services, adult protective services had been involved, and there has been miscommunications as to whether or not an investigation was going or not. And the credit union, I should say, if you listen to the story, said there were thousands of dollars, especially at the beginning of the month, being taken out. And even though this gentleman was getting $5,000 a month, he was broke. Both cars were repossessed. The power and electric were never being paid, and the water, garbage. So this gentleman, when he ended up going to the hospital now, was not allowed to come back and just dumped in an apartment. And it was only through the manager of this apartment complex that the stepdaughter, became involved again to find out what happened to this man. So the police department's lying about how much they've known about this. They have chosen not to act. For whatever reason, the credit union should have been notified or should have had a flag on activity that was changing. I don't know how these people were able to get power of attorney as a daughter without any kind of representation to that effect or proof. So everybody failed this gentleman. And this is what happens when we do not take care of our own. The government will fail you, and it is incumbent upon us to look after our elderly. I have a friend who's he specializes in senior law and estate planning. He's an attorney out in New York and New Jersey. He practices in both states. And I will be having him on after the beginning of the year to talk about how important it is to have a plan, because one of the red flags I saw in this case was that here we had a property signed over and the power of attorney to a stepdaughter, but this gentleman was left in a very vulnerable position because he had no legal claim and right of ownership and possession to this piece of property, and that complicates matters. So this is something that you really, really need to think about and not get family arguments in the way of doing what is right. And it's not very easy. I have a similar situation in my life, and even if somebody doesn't want you there, you got to keep an eye out and look after them, even if they don't want you to. Jeff, did you want to talk about this at all and have any comments?
Well, again, this is going back to the same issue that we're seeing with everything else. That's why I played that Twilight Zone piece. There is no God. There is no truth. There's no values. There's nothing. There's only the government, and everyone's depending on the government. Katrina, where's the government? Sandy, where's the government?
Yes.
Where's the government for this guy? No. The problem is, where's the family? That's what's lost here. The families have been destroyed. The whole idea that there's something more important than government has been lost.
And I know at the start of after Christmas, after New Year's in January, we're going to be starting with a series of shows about, for instance, Agenda 21, which is now Agenda 30, how the UNESCO program, United Nations Education, Social, Cultural Organization, has a goal of supplanting the role of family and separating us from our traditions, the family most important, because that is the means by which they can eradicate the individual mentality in favor of the collective. And as we know, in totalitarian regimes, in a system of government that is communist, Marxist, very progressive, which is exactly what the United Nations is seeking to achieve, the New World Order, one world government, we have to get rid of this individual mindset, that the individual matters, that liberty matters, and that everything is for the collective, for the common good. And that's the means by which they do it. And what we're seeing now is examples of what happens when people start looking again to the government to help people. And we see the dissolution of traditional families. And again, looking towards the government to preserve family. There's excuse me, I'm going to talk about what happens. My friend Connor Boyack, who's out here in Utah, he has the Libertas Institute, and I had him on my other show. By the way, you can hear my other shows that were on the Veritas Radio Network. The Suzanne option is still being played every day, every evening you can hear. So you can just go to Veritas Radio Network and see what's playing now. And you can hear those shows on preview if you don't have a membership. So I do like people to still hear those. I think they're still relevant. But Jeff, what happens is we can see there's an article I'm going to talk about after our break. What happens when in places like Sweden, the government takes the place of the family? Now, people are looking, as we've talked about, towards the government to solve all our problems. Last week, I discussed what the role of government should be and the type of government that was consented to here in this continental landmass. I do not like to call it a nation. And then people say, well, just call it a country then. No, we're still buying into that one geopolitical unit. We were really founded as a union. It was a compact of 13 sovereign and independent states on a par with nations. And these nation states had a right to dissolve or leave this union at a time of their choosing. Coincidentally, it is John Taylor of Caroline's birthday today, who had said that the states, in an ultimate act of sovereignty, created this general government, and at any time of their choosing, they could reassert their sovereignty by dissolving this union if it no longer suited their needs. This is a sentiment that goes back to the Declaration of Independence, which also goes back to John Locke. We talked about John Locke last week. And just to reiterate what John Locke felt, he expressed, I think this was from an article I had quoted last week from fee.org, and that's still up on my page, but he expressed a view that was radical at the time, that government is morally obliged to serve people by not providing free education, not providing health care, not providing safety, but by protecting life, liberty, and property. He explained that the principle of checks and balances to limit government power. He favored representative government and a rule of law. He denounced tyranny. He insisted that when government violates individual rights, people may legitimately rebel. And this is what we have to get back to, this mindset of keeping government focused on its legitimate roles. When we get back to the break, I want to share with you an article about what happens when we have the government trying to take the role of family. It's again from ConnorBoyack.com, and promoting measures to maintain and strengthen the family. And we have an issue here when the government tries to promote the family. At what point does the government, again, need to just back out and preserve liberty and stay out of the family? So we'll be back in a few moments. This is the Wasatch Report. Suzanne Sherman here on the Cerberus Radio Network, defending freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny.
Suzanne Sherman, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics. The Wasatch Report, every Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, on the Cerberus Radio Network. Looking for a new custom camo dress or scarf? Tail Gunner Apparel. Looking for bath and body products for women and men? Tail Gunner Apparel. Looking for bed scarves and custom home products? Tail Gunner Apparel. Look awesome and feel even better. Tail Gunner Apparel on Facebook or at tailgunnerapparel.etsy.com. That's tailgunnerapparel.etsy.com.
Made love and then you cried. Remember when?
Jeff Johnson, transporting 18th century ideas to our 21st century minds. The Paradigm Shift, every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Cerberus Radio Network. Cerberus Radio Network, protecting liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny.
Silent night.
Welcome back, everybody. We're just coming back from our break here on the Wasatch Report. Suzanne Sherman with Jeff Johnson in the studio at the Cerberus Radio Network, defending freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny. In the first segment, we were discussing what happens when we abrogate our role as family members and looking out for each other and disavowing our personal responsibility and allowing the government to fulfill that role that we have abrogated. And for a gentleman in Pennsylvania, it turned out very poorly, where a VA assigned assistant and her family took this man's life over, took him for thousands and thousands of dollars, and made him essentially unable to even live in his own home. It is up to us to protect our family members, to look out for them, even if we're not quite getting along. I want to turn our attention in this segment to an article. It's a blog on my friend Connor Boyack. He is the head of the Libertas Institute out here. He also has some books out called The Tuttle Twins, a book called Passion Driven Education, and Dr. Ron Paul and Tom Woods endorse these books from him as well. So it is a great resource. I really love the way Connor thinks. He had been on my show before. I'll need to get him back on this one again. But he has a blog that came out this last week, and I'll put it on our pages today, about promoting measures to maintain and strengthen the family. And this is an LDS, a Latter-day Saints, a Mormon perspective on family. And here's one thing that I noticed when I moved out to Utah was a bit of it was a bit perplexing to me that the LDS faith embraces government so much. And to me, the Mormons had come here to Utah to escape persecution, but now what we have here later on, about 150 or so years later, that they're embracing the very national entity that persecuted them in the first place. And what I'll do at some point is have somebody that is a member of that faith to discuss that with me. I don't want to put words into their mouth, but it's something I did notice, and Connor addresses that here. And there was a speech, I was just there's a Mormon museum in Temple Square, and we went there to see the lights the other night, and they played a film that Connor refers to here. I believe this, if that was the right one, October 1955, was a General Relief Society meeting, and the president had rose to the podium to deliver some remarks on the family, and that it reiterated how strong the role of the family should be in society. But he also said here, we call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. So Connor states here that this is an open invitation that produced a wide variety of interpretations. Which kinds of measures, he asks, exactly are designed to strengthen the family? And how does one strengthen a family? And what are these measures specific to government only, or are they more societal in nature? And as I had said earlier, though, many Latter-day Saints have differing views on these questions. And I know in California, when we had the Proposition 8 up for a vote, and Proposition 8 was the voting, the proposition to make marriage one man, one woman in the state of California. And it was supported by 70% of the voters. It actually passed, but a federal judge came out and ruled against it. So the progressives got their way by doing an end run around the vote of the people to the liberal federal judiciary. But the Mormon Church was very much involved in the fight in support of Proposition 8. So what he talks about here are measures being referred to by the proclamation are government-oriented. He believes that a narrowing of their focus, narrowing to a battle-defining marriage, is problematic, for there are many other governmental programs and policies already implemented which attack and weaken the family. In light of these very real threats to the family, worrying about semantics seems silly. He talks about the case of Sweden, and this resonates with me because my mother's from Sweden. Half of my family is from Sweden. And I remember when I have traveled there, I've been there 3 times, I very specifically remember a conversation where my mother and one of her cousins were looking out over a valley and all these homes, and they said, yes, you know, our taxes here are very high, about 90% or above. And they look at all the houses and they all look the same. And then what they said is this is a good thing, but everybody here is the same. Everybody has the same house. Everybody has the same. They just kept saying everybody here is the same, like it was a good thing. And I look back on this now, and if that was not a case of just blatant brainwashing, I don't know what is. Now, Connor's wife served in a mission for the LDS Church in Sweden. And here's his take on what happens in Sweden. He says that Sweden is a striking example of how socialism affects the family unit. Sky-high taxes, massive welfare spending, entitlements galore, a criminalization of homeschooling, that's crucial, a variety of institutional programs to get kids into state care and mothers into the workforce, combined to create a society in which the state is an intimate provider, partner, and caretaker from cradle to grave. That's why I brought in that case. This all just fell together, really, that the situation with Don Cameron, this is what happens when the state takes care of us to the grave. They will fail you. Connor says that his wife lived in Sweden while serving as a mission for the LDS Church, and during that time, she encountered one family, only one, where the mother stayed home to focus on raising the children and creating a warm and loving home. The uniqueness of this encounter suggests how successful the institutional efforts have become in Sweden to pull mothers away from the home, collect the children into the care of the state throughout the day, and break apart the natural ties between parents and children. Now, this is what I said before. Socialism seeks to dissolve the individual in favor of the collective for the greater good. By breaking down the traditional family unit is the way to achieve this nefarious goal. Connor continues, considering the status of the family in such a socialist state helps us understand why the conventional interpretation of the proclamation's concluding paragraph that promoting measures to strengthen the family means fighting same-sex marriage is horribly short-sighted. Now I'm going back to the speech that I referred to from the society guidelines about preserving family. And he says in that the United States is by no means exempt from these dangers. Sweden may be further down the socialist path than the United States, but this government has pedaled us rapidly in the same direction in past decades. It may be instructive to consider a few of the programs. So Connor now picks a few of these apart in this country, Union, beg your pardon, and I have to say he's spot on. So I'm going to address these, and we've talked about these before. And as I go through this, compare and contrast what I mentioned earlier about Lockean principles of the traditional role of government that should be protecting life, liberty, and property. He starts out by talking about the war on drugs, and this is a policy which hurts the family. The prisons are chock full of nonviolent drug offenders. Remember, now we have federal sentencing guidelines, and we have federal criminalization of drugs, marijuana. And remember, under the Constitution as ratified, the general government has the authority to punish 3 offenses: treason, piracy on the high seas, and counterfeiting. Yet, we have national drug laws. We also have a war on drugs, which tears away, going back to the article now, fathers from their wives and children, leads to an increase in welfare dependence and a rise in child delinquency. The war on drugs doesn't just target the men. There are now over 8 times as many women incarcerated in state and federal prisons and local jails as there were in 1980. A recent study on the impact of drug laws on families and women, specifically between 1986 and 1999, the number of women incarcerated in state facilities for drug-related offenses has increased by 888%. Now, I am not advocating drug use, but there comes a point, at what point do you take crimes that could be victimless? If somebody wants to smoke marijuana in their home and turn it into a crime and take a father away, at what point is it okay to substitute the government's judgment for what is good for you and what is harmful? And that's a line that people have to come up with. But what we have right now, an out-and-out war on drugs, has served to only create more crime, has served to only benefit the law enforcement agencies. He talks here about January 4th, 2008, police officers in Ohio executed a SWAT raid to arrest a gentleman named Anthony Terry, and he was dealing drugs. The drug warriors opened fire after entering the home, killing an unarmed girlfriend and mother of 6 and wounding her 14-month-old son, who was in her arms. The former SWAT commander for the police department stated on record in commenting on the incident that it is, quote, not unusual for children to be inside homes raided by police officers. That's the end of the quote. In far too many cases, innocent children, spouses, relatives, or visitors have been arrested, injured, or in many cases killed when police officers were waging their war on drugs. There's also a book called Who Killed the Constitution by Kevin Gutzman and Tom Woods, and they discuss some of these federal marijuana laws and the war on drugs. Also, The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balco talks about how this has been just such a cash cow for law enforcement agencies, and also destroys our system of federalism when you have a federalizing of local police forces from cash incentives, equipment, and then they have the need to use them. So this is why we have this war on drugs, federal asset, civil asset forfeiture. It's really strips away our liberties once again under the premise of something that is good for us. Just say no to drugs, the war on drugs. But we also have, going back to what Connor says here, whether causing psychological trauma in a raid, or locking up a family's breadwinner in a cage, or killing one or more members of the family, the war on drugs, he says, is a war on the family. Promoting measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family should therefore include significantly scaling back, if not altogether eliminating, a frontal assault on families nationwide. I'm quoting, pardon my use of the N-word. The so-called poverty, now we turn to the war on poverty, produces, as we have seen, nothing but more poverty. You know, Jeff, I say this all the time. If you want more of whatever it is you're trying to get rid of, just declare a war against it from our federal government, be it poverty, be it drugs, be it terror. You get more of all of that and less what? Less liberty. So we have here the war on poverty produces, unsurprisingly, a similar result. Social welfare programs provided by government also break apart family cohesion. They suppress fertility rates, encourage bearing of children out of wedlock, incentivize fatherlessness, and promote multi-generational dependency upon the state rather than among members of the family unit. Once again, we have now a substitution of government for traditional family roles, and the breadwinners, the providers for the family. Now these people are paid to disavow the traditional family unit. We know what Lyndon Baines Johnson said when he was signing his Great Society's legislation, and the goal was to really keep Black Americans voting for the Democrats, and pretty much in perpetuity. I can't even talk right now. In favor, so they could stay in power. It really wasn't intended to better the lives of these people. It was, again, to preserve power, which really is the goal of these government programs. John Goodman, who is president of the National Center for Political Analysis, said that the USA's welfare system is a disaster. It is creating poverty, not destroying it. It subsidizes divorce, unwed teenage pregnancy, the abandonment of elderly parents by their children. Let's go back to the first segment here, and wholesale dissolution of the family. Why? We pay people to be poor. There are hundreds of other government programs and policies, likewise undermining the strength and solidarity of the family unit. Once again, they get away with this by saying it is for our good. Look at the Federal Reserve, and this is what Connor refers to also in the article. The artificial manipulation of the economy causes untold economic hardship, adds stress and strain to fragile family ties. The makeup of families are altered. Fornication encouraged, though a legal system which condones the termination of the lives of unwanted, unborn children, 56 million and counting. High taxation and onerous regulations on small businesses leads both parents into the workforce in pursuit of a decent standard of living, leaving the children again in the care of institutions or other non-family persons. Subsidies and bailouts of certain businesses and industries put many people out of business and often raise everybody else's prices along the way. Look at the minimum wage laws. It's having the exact opposite effects it was intended to have, leading to a diminished standard of living, dependence on government, and further financial strain on families. So, what we're seeing is the dissolution of family values under the premises and auspices of assisting families. And we have a system now where people are working 5 months out of the year for money to go to the government. And I see this. I was raised in an environment where my mom stayed home. My parents agreed that my dad was going to be the breadwinner, and my mom was going to keep the fires burning at home, and she took care of me. I remember being walked to school. I remember her, if I walked home, she was sitting on the doorstep waiting for me. I was raised by my mom, and we're not seeing that. Now we're seeing these moms putting their kids into daycare at as early as 6 weeks of age. And Hillary Clinton even said about getting these kids into now government preschool. We can't get to these. We have to get to these kids early. Well, why is that? What is being taught in the school? What is being taught in the school? These kids are being indoctrinated into these socialist programs. Jeff, we talk about this all the time, the Pledge of Allegiance. They are taught this. We see media campaigns, Connor's talking about here, individual advocacy, education programs, events, other marketing incentives should be explored to encourage these ideals, as opposed to the government supplanting our judgment. Because he says here, it's important to note that the proclamation does not narrow calls for promoting government measures. It's encouraging devotion to doctrines of marriage and family is not and should not be limited to legislation. Here's an example of legislation and why it fails, because it will succumb to political correctness. And here's an example of what is happening in Utah. So we have a bill that's intended to promote marriage, something that really does not fall within the traditional Lockean role of government. But we have a bill, this is from Fox Salt Lake City, a bill that raises marriage license fees, offers a rebate if you take a premarital counseling course. It has passed the Senate. And this is another thing that's interesting. 3 lawmakers were absent. Where else but the government can you get a job, consistently not show up to work, and still get paid in full pension benefits? Only the government. The bill would raise the cost of a marriage license in Utah by $20, but offers a $20 discount if couples take a premarital counseling course online or in person. And this was put forth. We have a Republican, Senator Christensen, argues that the bill would be good for couples considering marriage and what goes into it. Wouldn't it be nice if people learned this from going to church? Former Utah First Lady Jacqueline Leavitt testified in favor of the bill, saying that the counseling reduces the chance of divorce. It can make a difference in marriage. It's about encouraging and promoting couples. And I think this is really an acknowledgement that people right now are not going to church. They're not being raised in families where God plays a primary role. And they're going to now substitute the government's judgment for what used to be family traditions by requiring often now secular counseling. And this is what's crucial here. The bill passed after Senator Daniel Thatcher changed the words husband and wife to spouses. So now we have a bill that ostensibly promotes marriage. Marriage is one man, one woman, to now gay marriage. So that is the only way you can interpret this legislation, is to allow for gay marriage. Salt Lake City has a huge LGBTQ LMNOP community. The mayor is gay, and I can only think that this is, a political correct approach now to promoting marriage, but promoting very ungodly behavior at the same time. So the only thing that I could see how you can reconcile this inconsistence would be to get government out of marriage from the very beginning. Now, granted, yes, this is a state issue. It is a 10th Amendment issue. Utah does have the right to make these laws. Marriage was never defined. It was never a delegated power granted to the general government. But again, I would think that Utah should also be consistent. I would like to see them honor Lockean principles and just be out of the business of marriage altogether. What do you, don't you think that's something the government should stay out of, Jeff? I really would like to see that.
Yeah, but well, that's again, man, how can you not love that obsolete man piece I played? Because this is, again, where government is replacing God, capital G, with God of government. What was a right of the church, marriage, between one man and one woman, is now a function of government that they can decide, well, what's next? One man, one horse? Yeah. You know, I mean, it's, well, I mean, there's, you name it, it's going to get crazy because man is replacing God with man.
And, you know, I think this is something that we see. It's not going away. And I'm looking forward, Jeff, to us having our Agenda 21. We're going to play that Agenda 21 for Dummies throughout some of the shows starting the new year. And what I want to do next year, I've been doing a lot of soul searching the past few days as to the direction we want this to go. And I'm going to try and tie all of these themes together where we can see why the government has asserted such power for itself. Again, this is John Taylor of Caroline's birthday today, and what he tried to fight against, like Patrick Henry, you quote him a lot. I've been reading a book called A Century of War, and this was put out by Mises.org. And if we can see, and this is why what was so scary to me, like in Sweden, homeschooling was outlawed. Eric Holder, when he was the Attorney General, there was a case about a homeschooling family from Germany, and there was a issue with them. And one of the quotes that I remember from Eric Holder was, "There is no right to homeschool. You have no fundamental right to homeschool." California had a lowercase decision that said they tried to implement an opinion on homeschooling that only credentialed teachers had the rights to homeschool their own children. The government is going to be coming down on homeschooling. I see that in the future. And the reason why is homeschooling families are more traditional. This is why they also want to get the mothers into the workplace so they can pay more taxes. I'm going to try and tie all this together when we see what happens, how this all perpetuates big government. It takes away our liberties, as well as the role of warfare, and also referring to what I alluded to in my article published by the 10th Amendment Center, the Church of the National Government. We have seen this is all one big web, how between the schools, the media, keeping people enslaved to this burdensome taxation system, all supported by also an unsound system backed by fiat currency, backed by nothing, where we're going to have inflation. People simply cannot keep up. And you see this time and time again, people saying, well, I just don't have time to homeschool. We have to work. You need to simplify. People that really want to do it can do it. Simplify it. It is a big sacrifice. But if we don't start doing it, we're going to have another generation of kids that are going to be completely and successfully indoctrinated by the government. It's only a matter of time for them. So I'm going to be focusing on that a lot and explain a lot about how false history is teaching children. In this book, A Century of War, they go into the truth, and I realize the inconsistencies of what I was taught about, say, the Spanish-American War, and going back into these other wars, World War I, World War II, how these were considered great wars, and how, again, Lincoln's War, we understand the truth here. Because if you see how the government benefits by war, by unrest and people relying on it. It is both on a global scale and, as we saw in a little community in a township in Pennsylvania, this is a rust that is permeating every aspect of society from the bottom on up. So Jeff, I want to take a few minutes. I've been getting some questions about food storage and how to process game. I was going to spend more time on it, but this story and situation came up last night. But essentially, I want to let people know that my strategy for storing food for longer term, I kind of break this down into short term and longer term. I, of course, have a lot of freeze-dried foods for longer term or certain emergencies in buckets if we have to make a quick getaway or go somewhere and supplement meals or live on them for a few days at a time. But I also try to have food on hand that I can use that is not as portable. I'm a huge proponent of canning. So I also buy canned goods. I have some of those here. I try to make the foods that I have on hand something that people are going to eat and enjoy. I like to say survive. You can survive, but you can also thrive. So what I like to do is can foods and particularly my wild game. So I just want to share some of these recipes with you, just kind of lighten the mood, Jeff. I said I'd be getting into a little bit more prepping. So I recently got a really nice buck deer this year. And what I did with him was I cut him up and brined him and then pressure canned the meat. And the recipe for the brine that I wanted to share was Whole Foods actually had a really nice spiced apple cider. And I mixed that as a recipe at about 50-50. I put some Worcestershire sauce, some other herbs in there and let it soak overnight. And then I would put the meat and the brine in canning jars and pressure can it. And I've given a few away and people say it makes absolutely the best sandwiches. I think like a French dipped sandwich. So do consider canning meat. And you don't have to do this just with game. I started by canning chicken. In fact, last week I was under the weather and I had canned some chicken breasts and some stock. In fact, it will make its own stock as you cook this. And I threw together those canned chicken breasts, just dumped the jar in a slow cooker, and some stock that I had made after turkey dinner, as well as some vegetables that I had on hand. And that's another reason I like to keep dehydrated vegetables of any kind. You can dump them into stock ready-made, even have the powdered stock in case you need to throw a quick soup together. So I just took that and then some dried noodles out of the pantry. Now, noodles obviously aren't going to be as long-term because they do disintegrate over time. But something like that, you can throw together a soup or a stew and do very well. And the benefit of canning meats is that if you are in a long-term power outage, you don't have to rely on your freezer. So use the stuff in your freezer first and go to some of this. And Jeff, have you ever canned any game or had any canned wild game or meat?
No, I haven't. I've never had canned game meat. We've always frozen.
It really?
I mean, because that's just, I never really gave it a thought to canning.
Yeah, and that's one thing I like to do. I will grind mine up. Like I will grind up. Typically when I get a deer, I'll grind it and then cook it just like ground beef. And I will add seasonings and onions and just cook it up, throw it in the pressure canner. And then we have lots of recipes you can use that for. Anything that you would use ground beef for, you can throw this into spaghetti sauce. You can use it for salads, tacos. I like to make what I call Wasatch Mountain enchiladas. So I will use that and make enchiladas. And, it's so versatile. And again, if you're in a situation where you have long-term power out, you can't possibly eat all the meat you're going to have before it goes bad. So I really like to store and keep it that way for long-term preservation. So I believe, Jeff, this is going to be our last show of the year. And as I stated, I've got some plans for next year. I was talking to our good friend Dwayne Stovall yesterday, who's running for United States Senate to hopefully defeating John Cornyn, who I think gave him a huge gift by supporting the Feinstein-backed new gun control regulation that's going to be tacked onto national reciprocity. And I was saying, it's really sometimes people like us trying to talk about proper scale of government and representative form of government. People just aren't really receptive to that message, and it's a very difficult one to get out. And we don't have the followership that some of these other people that are preaching constitutional rights and liberty and freedom, but really not, telling us they don't really understand that at all. And it gets a little bit demoralizing at times to see the followership they have. And what I told Dwayne yesterday is, I thought maybe I don't want to even bother doing this anymore, but at some point people will find this on YouTube. We will have a record preserved for people to listen to. And he said, and you know what? They're going to look back and say, she was right. They tried to warn us all along of what the dangers of substituting government for family and God are going to be, and for looking towards this national government to solve our problems, the dangers of not being prepared. These people over this little, hokey Cerberus radio network, they were right. They knew what they were talking about. I'm going to post also my friend Dave Benner's statements today about John Taylor of Caroline. He was absolutely prophetic. He knew what was coming. One of my quotes that I like about John Taylor of Caroline was that he said, beware of the unholy alliance between government and finance. And boy, hasn't that proven to be true as well. So on that note, I guess we're going to come back after the new year. Jeff and I are going to have a series on the dangers of UNESCO and Agenda 21, now Agenda 30, and how important it is to preserve what we have with our liberty, our family units, and keeping God in our life. How about your plans for your show in the new year, Jeff? What do you got in store?
Now, the music started. You have 3.5 minutes. Okay. There's 3.5 minutes of music. So we're not rushing that much. It's just going to play in the I plan on continuing with my anti-federalist because, like I said during my show, if you don't like what I'm saying, go to the historical record, prove me wrong. I'll admit if I'm wrong. If you can find the historical record where Patrick Henry and Washington and all them demanded the Pledge of Allegiance, a national anthem, find it, prove me wrong, and I'll say I'm wrong. But I'm just going to keep going with what I'm doing.
Yeah, and the frustrating thing is, even if you try and give some of these people the irrefutable historic backdrop, for instance, the gun rights people are probably the hardest headed. They're worse than the progressives to try and reason with, is they just keep insisting, even in light of now tacking on these gun control regulations. I'll put up an article that actually explains this background check by making the FBI not accountable to their mistakes is worse for us. But hey, we're adding this to more gun rights, national reciprocity. It's good for us. Damn the facts. They just want to ignore the roles that the states are going to have if something good is going to go their way. And this, to me, if these people were the critics of the Affordable Care Act, who now are supporting national reciprocity, this inconsistency, this intellectual dishonesty is going to be our demise just as fast as the progressive movement is. Again, we have what I refer to time and time again, the trifecta of evil, keeping us uneducated, keeping us indoctrinated, and that is the media, that is the education system, that is the government. The latter of the three licenses, controls the former two by these power grabs, throwing off its constitutional constraints. And that's why I try to talk about the Constitution, not in the context that we need to preserve it and to go back, but we need to learn what our mistakes were, because I don't see this system as lasting forever. I think it's been a failed experiment. I'd like to learn from our mistakes. These people were right. John Taylor of Caroline was right. Patrick Henry was right. Where are the Patrick Henrys today? Where are the Paul Reveres of today that are trying to warn people about our losses of liberty? And maybe that's us. And I hope people will start listening. If you like this show, if you like what we have to say here, it's important that you share and you try to spread the word, because I get a lot of comments, love your show. Well, hey, how about if you share it and get other people listening as well? We need to get the information out. If somebody else is doing it, that's fantastic. I don't know of many right now that are doing it, so I'm just going to be evangelical, keep our nose to the grind and keep getting the work out and hope it pays off. So on that note, I want to wish everybody, Jeff, thank you very much. I want to wish you a very Merry Christmas. Have a safe, happy, prosperous New Year. And we're going to come back and hit it hard. God bless you, everybody.
We'll have a jubilee. They're gonna build a toyland town all around the Christmas tree.
You better watch out.
You better not cry.
You better not pout.
I'm a telling you why.
Santa Claus is coming.